The State Museum of New Western Art as a laboratory for the Museum of Artistic Culture. First of all, I'd like to thank the Shchukin Museum and the organizers of the conference for a chance to take part in such an interesting event. The idea of the Museum of Artistic Culture included collections by Shchukin and Morozov into its orbit because at the beginning it was planned to combine the Western and Russian material, and later on the bar was lowered, and finally the Museum of Artistic Culture was to include certain works introducing new methods. However, the museums that opened in Moscow and Petrograd accumulated only Russian art. The collections of Shchukin and Morozov as the first and second museums of New Western art remained separate institutions. However, the Petrograd Museum was still trying to receive French artists. They were considered to be the starting point of contemporary movements, that they had influenced our artists, and without them it is impossible to research artistic culture. When Malevich became head of the Petrograd Museum of Artistic Culture, he supported this position. He wanted the fullest combination and inclusion of the collections. I quote, "The Museum of Western Art should be a division of the Museum of Artistic Culture, for only we shall be able to make sense of the works we are working with. Only in the classification of influences can we establish the correct pathway." Malevich understood that the museums would not allow for such a radical change. He said they would be afraid because this would disrupt the historical formality of the collection. The territorial and geographical displayment would be different, and the museum workers are afraid to even change the order in which the paintings are hanging. And indeed, the scientific and pedagogical practice of the new museums and the institute, the work with the Morozov and Shchukin collections became important, and at least for the summer the new museum became the laboratory for the State Institute of Artistic Culture. This work had two goals: the inward research goal and the outward, that was concerned with the introduction of the results of the internal research into the museum practice. The Museum of Artistic Culture, and Malevich said that we should give the frame to the new Western art, the new modern art, because the Russian Museum opened the rooms for new art, contemporary art, and the collection of Western art in Moscow, he said, doesn't have the metrics, the provenance is unknown, and the reasons for the change in the artistic ways are also unknown. The evidence of business trips to Moscow in the archives exists, and very often, sometimes at their own expense, Vera Yermolaeva and Konstantin Rojdestinsky used to work in Moscow. In the characteristics given to Konstantin Rojdestinsky for his postgraduate studies, this aspect of his work was mentioned specifically. It was said that he was working in the Moscow Museum of Contemporary French Art with the works of Cézanne and Neo-Impressionists. He is researching color and shape. However, there are few documents that are meaningful. We mostly have some mission orders, plans and reports, and the mentionings of the reports made at the Academic Senate. The report by Yermolaeva about the Wren in the Moscow collections of contemporary French art are focused on discussing the general approach to the topic, on figuring out the contexts and influences. And we can find useful information in the diaries of Konstantin Rojdestvensky. For the first time, he went to Moscow in December 1923, soon after his internship at the Museum of Artistic Culture. He was probably assigned with an analytical task, but probably this was a first field trip that was necessary for serious studies. He knew the general ideas of the museum but had no system in his method. He was closely looking at Cézanne's paintings, and later on he would research him scientifically, looking at them in chronological order, trying to see the logic of his development from object to form, from intuitive findings to action aimed at a particular goal. So he sees that the artist is trying to create a complete living organism, to make the canvas a self-sufficient being. He sees that he takes care in the work of the axis and the contrasts, as in the girl at the piano and the self-portrait in the peaked cap, pays attention to the clean painting and to the color palette of the country. He notices the general tone and the leaking brownish paint that starts to fill the painting and is found in all the corners of the painting and in all the subjects. Rojdestvensky finds that Cubism originated from Cézanne, and that the main axis of the composition gave the power to the linear composition, that they worked with the object, not with the form. In December 24, January 25, Rojdestvensky was surprised by the ignorance of our academics and the Hutemas faculty. He said that they didn't recognize Matisse in Shchukin's collection and mixed him up with Cézanne, and found Meshkov, who wasn't there. He says that it is important to feel the logical connections between Monet, Renoir, Flamenc, from Mangan to Cézanne. That's important for our artistic development. In 1927, the State Institute of Artistic Culture was merged with the Institute of Art History, but the work continued. Rojdestvensky was going to Moscow again to find out the difference and the interconnectedness of the leaking paintings with the color palette. If the color palette is the sum of its dominants, then Cézanne's palette is definitely defined by the leaking paints. But in the Cubist geometry, I think the paintings are built not on the leaking, but on the earth tone palette. But since if the artist is working with one color or with the colors that are a family, there should be no leaking because there are no contrasts that should be unified. However, we don't know how exactly the research took place in the museum, but we can judge its results according to the program of the Institute of Artistic Culture and some reports. The Institute studied the formation and the mechanisms of the evolution of contemporary art using the methods of scientific research. Biological and medical metaphors were used. Malevich said that artistic research should be based on the existing sciences. He wanted to substitute the aesthetic centimeter of taste by a scientific one, which would include statistical materials with a verifiable and reproducible result. The Institute of Artistic Culture was studying the canvas itself, aiming to see the surface of the flat painting that lay hidden, as Malevich said, to distinguish the physical shape of the painting, where they operated on the painting's body. The Institute's method uses the autopsy term, comparing the Institute with a surgery clinic and a bacteriological laboratory. So what were they looking for during these autopsies of the paintings of the Museum of the New Western Painting? At the form, the lines, volume, composition, structure, the paintings, the color, the light. How did they analyze? At first they found the most basic linear elements, fixed them in graphics, aiming to differentiate their character and their properties. Then they put them into a special table, finding the order of the way two or more elements are interconnected. After that, they found out the important fragments. These were whole shapes and their closest interconnections. Thus, the basic structural elements were found: the fibrous curve of Cézanne, the crescentic shape of Cubism, and the rectangular plane of Suprematism. This was a true laboratory research, mostly taking place in the Museum of New Western Painting. The data received was introduced into systems and differentiated. So the hypothesis of Malevich was generally agreed upon, and a theory of an additional element was created. As soon as the painting started to introduce elements of different ones, the whole artistic work began to reshape. So the State Institute staff could prove which elements of Cézanne could influence the cubistic shape, how the early pre-cubist works of Braque, Fauconnier and Picasso led to the origination of Cubism, what Derain took from Cézanne, and how is the cubist form shaped, and how it is different in different stages. They also researched color in a similar way, combining the spectra, which was a separate form of the analysis of the artistic field of the painting. There were bars where all the colors that took place in the painting were fixed. This spectrum reflected the qualitative and quantitative palette of the paintings, their interconnection and their harmony. Thus, the color structure of the work. Artifacts such as tables and drawings, maps were created to portray the research process and to exemplify it. So I will just show a few examples. These are tables by Malevich containing the additional elements and the way these spectra were compiled, how these linear elements were researched. Another table you can see, these are the analytical color tables by Rojdestensky, where he analyzed works from the Shchukin collection. Here are two works from the Shchukin collection taking part in the defining of painting and the color palette. There were artistic fragments, texture and structure, analytical canvases, and variations. The documents contain evidence of copies of fragments of the Rouen cathedrals by Manet and the Pines by Signac, the Woman on the Balcony by Matisse, Picasso's Pitcher and Bowl, still life, his Woman with the Guitar and Musical Instruments. The exhibitions of the research of the Institute was built using these artifacts. Now we have an interesting piece showcasing analytical copying. Yermolaeva combined on one canvas fragments of two works by Cézanne, the Viaduct and the Aix-en-Provence view of Montagne Saint-Victoire. She combined chronologically distant works which could showcase the constant and the changing in the works of Cézanne, showing the evolution of his creativity. We recently came across an interesting document, which is the diary of Anna Leporska, her notebook, with notes and drawings made during her visitations to the former Shchukin and Morozov collections in summer 1927. It was given to us together with the archive of Leporska by the Russian Museum. The State Institute was already interconnected with the State Institute of Art History. So Leporska was not busy with anything, and she said that she was especially pleased by looking at artwork without the necessity of reviewing and researching it. But she made lots of drawings that let us understand which artists and which works attracted the attention of researchers. Leporska used to work in the laboratory of color, headed by Yermolaeva, and she was contemplating the configuration of certain paintings. Picasso drew the biggest attention, the three women. The woman with a fan after the ball. So her notebook is really tiny, maybe less than 10 centimeters to 4 centimeters thick. A table in a cafe, bottle of Pernod, and this cubist still life touches her emotionally. She wrote, "It is strange now, even without thinking about that period, to see the bottle and a cup as if they are standing in front of me in space. But I think it's not enough to see them. Anyone can see them. We should feel something else." But Leporska adds more to her previous knowledge. She continues, "There is an old idea of color, but there is painting at this stage. However thinned down, and at the second stage it becomes more clear that there is a contrast." So ideas of Malevich and research of the Institute showed that there is no color, only the material later on. So Leporska also notices the still life with the book. As she names it, the still life with the book, she probably is talking about the composition with a bunch of grapes and a sliced pear, which was called The Books in Canveyler's gallery, where Shchukin wrote it. It was painted on smoky colored wallpaper and sneaking colored wallpaper is interrupted by dots of green and blue, as she writes. The farm woman not commented upon as after the ball. but her drawings speak for themselves quite distinctly, and it's important to see what she notices and what she emphasizes. She emphasizes the geometry, the mass, and the tenseness of the shape. This farmer woman was also researched by Vera Yermolaeva, and I'll also quote another document from Liporska's archive, which wasn't noticed by researchers before. She wrote that the geometrization was used as a certain kind of expressiveness which was possible until the looking into the plastic life of the shape hadn't gone too far. We could still give any individual a living form to it.
Her copy of the Man with Crossed Arms is very, very sketch-like. Just the overall outlines, general composition, and the colors are written in words. She writes this down as a one strike of light at the shoulder, and she shows this shoulder in her sketch as a very energetic arch. She has some small comments and sketches on the Rhin, the grove and the river at Montreuil-sur-Mer. She does not sketch the grove, but she writes about it. It looks like a Cretaceous period grove, an age where in the sky there is not sun but something else. It's just horror in the sky and among the trees. And for the portrait of a girl in black, the most important point is the fathomless blue depth. Liporska writes about Le Fauconnier with the toppled over lake, and the village in the mountains has a very expressive detail, a small house at the top of the painting, and Liporska writes this down. What Liporska saw was often filtered through her experience and the art of her friends. She found something in common between Le Fauconnier and the Enders, and the same she found in Pissarro's landscapes. She wrote that the Enders must have been correct with their expanded perspective. In the Rhin, she finds something in common with Konstantin Rozhdestensky, but she found Rozhdestensky having less contrast in the larger objects. Among other documents by Liporska, we have some very personal, very unusual reactions. In the portrait of Samari, she especially liked its crisscrossed nature, as if it's the life itself and not just the brush working there. Renoir she liked, but she wrote, "I want to tell Renoir, let's wait, my dear, I don't have time for you, we need something more than your perplexed women." She also took a look at the Impressionists. She thought that Sisley was rougher than Monet, and although he's more faithful to the nature, he's less natural than Monet. Monet has a much more living bits of nature. And earlier she had noticed the color of the meadows at Giverny, but now she looks more at the streams of paint. She didn't forget about Cézanne, the idol, and his La Montagne Sainte-Victoire, the much analyzed masterpiece. And here we've got it on the slide. He is close to nature without copying it, she says. Further she writes, not just painters can come out of Cézanne. This nakedness is not just painterly. And we should remember that for Malevich, Cézanne was the culmination of painting. And this clarity, this insight that cannot be preserved for long, it needs to be camouflaged by something. The tension to support this clarity cannot be found anywhere here. Only Casimir has found it and is able to preserve this clarity, writes Lipovskaya. The dialogue with the Shchukin-Morozov collection continues further on when the former State Institute students come to the gallery without any special research tasks. Lev Yudin comes to Moscow to the Museum of the New Western Painting in 1935, and he feels very energized and finds this art very joyous and lively. Coming back to St. Petersburg, he creates a list of priority names and works, and lists which of those are at the Hermitage. I'm sorry for the bad slide here. It's a reproduction of his list, and in this list are Gauguin with a landscape with two goats. Yudin writes that it's an example of good composition, and then his Flowers of France with its pinky clots. He likes the texture, he finds it noble, sticky and rough like a pumice. Another artist that he mentions in his list is Maurice Denis, and he finds something in common between himself and Denis in his texture, in his color palette, and his shapes. The palette interested him because he wanted to work with a certain spectrum of colors, maybe a lateral spectrum. Why? Because if we treat this in a contemporary manner, after Cubism, it becomes not lateral but universal or mainstream. That's what Yudin wrote, and he mentions the artist's wife portrait and The Meeting by Denis. The contacts with the Shchukin-Morozov collections had a significant impact on those artists' own works. We can see this in Yermolaeva, in Rozhdestvensky, and in Yudin. Here we have Yermolaeva and the Wren, and a portrait by Yudin compared with these examples. The lessons have been taken, and their own worldview transformed them. We should also remember that in the harsh 1930s, the Western Art Museum played a very special role because censorship was extremely harsh, inappropriate works could not be exhibited, and they were purged from exhibitions. But these funny paintings by the Western freaks, as Malevich had put this, still existed in the public space, somehow giving a breath of fresh air, giving energy, as Yudin put this, allowed people to keep the true perspective, as Rozhdestvensky said, and made an image of living art in the age of lifelike art. Thank you.